April 30th, 1943. Jebel Tarhant, Tunisia. The hill, called 609 by the Americans, rose like a fortress from the African landscape, its rocky summit 2,000 feet above the surrounding plains. In the pre-dawn darkness, Wehrmacht Obergefreiter Klaus Richter pressed his body against cold stone, his carabiner 98 Courage clutched tight against his chest. The rifle felt familiar, reliable, the same bolt-action design his father had carried in the last war. Around him, men from Regiment Barenthin whispered prayers in German, their voices lost in the wind that scraped across the barren heights. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. They had held this position for days, their artillery observers directing fire across the valley below, keeping the American advance at bay. Richter had confidence. The Kar-98 was accurate, dependable. He could place a round at 400 meters without hesitation. 5 rounds in the internal magazine, work the bolt smoothly between shots. It was the rhythm of war his instructors had drilled into him since basic training, precision over speed, discipline over chaos. But at the base of the hill, something was changing. Through the darkness came sounds that didn't fit. Not the familiar crack of Springfield rifles the Americans had carried earlier in the campaign. Something faster. More insistent, a sustained roar of fire that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The attack began as a grey line of American infantry emerged from the morning mist. Richter brought his rifle to his shoulder, worked the bolt to chamber his first round. Breathe, aim, fire. The recoil kicked against his shoulder. He pulled the bolt up, back, ejecting the spent brass. Forward, down. Chamber the next round. Another American fell. But before he could fire again, the sound hit him like a physical force. Crack. Crack, 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 crack. Not the measured pace of bolt-action rifles. This was different. Each American rifleman seemed to be firing as fast as he could pull the trigger. 8 rounds without pause. No break to work a bolt. No interruption in their aim. The volume of incoming fire was staggering, overwhelming. Bullets chipped the rocks around Richter's position, forcing him to duck. By the time he raised his head to fire again, the Americans had advanced 20 meters. He worked his bolt, fired, worked his bolt, fired. 5 rounds expended. Now he had to reload, fumbling with a stripper clip, pressing 5 fresh rounds down into the internal magazine with his thumb. Precious seconds lost. Seconds where the Americans kept firing, where their rifles kept speaking with that relentless, mechanical voice. One of Richter's comrades, a young soldier from Bavaria named Werner, was hit while reloading. His Kar-98 clattered against the rocks, 3 rounds still in the magazine. He had managed to fire only twice in the time it took the Americans to empty entire clips. The mathematics of the engagement were brutal, undeniable. For every German shot, 3 American rounds answered. Historical records from the Battle of Hill 609 paint a clear picture of what the Wehrmacht faced that morning. The American 34th Infantry Division, equipped with M1 Garand rifles, was attacking one of the strongest defensive positions in Tunisia. But the defenders, despite their advantageous position and determined resistance, were being outshot by a margin they had not anticipated. American soldiers could fire 40 to 50 accurate rounds per minute. German soldiers with their Kar-98 rifles could manage perhaps 15 to 20 at most. The M1 Garand had entered service with the United States Army in 1936, making America the first nation to issue a semi-automatic rifle as standard equipment to its infantry forces. Designed by Canadian-American John Cantius Garand, after 17 years of development at Springfield Armory, the rifle represented a fundamental shift in infantry tactics. It fired the powerful 30-06 Springfield cartridge, launching a 150-grain projectile at 2,850 feet per second. The genius lay in its gas-operated rotating bolt system. When fired, a small portion of propellant gas was tapped from a port near the muzzle, driving an operating rod that cycled the action automatically. Each pull of the trigger fired 1 round, with the gas pressure automatically ejecting the spent case and chambering the next round. No manual bolt operation required. The shooter never had to break his sight picture, never had to move his firing hand from the trigger. The rifle held 8 rounds in an en-bloc clip that inserted from above into a fixed internal magazine. A trained soldier could reload in under 3 seconds. More importantly, he could maintain a constant rate of fire that overwhelmed enemy positions designed to withstand the slower tempo of bolt-action rifles. By contrast, the Wehrmacht's Karabiner 98 Courage, adopted in June 1935, was a refined and shortened version of the legendary Gewehr 98 design. The Kar 98 was indeed an excellent bolt-action rifle. Its Mauser action was strong, reliable, and accurate. Many consider it one of the finest bolt-action rifles ever produced, but it remained fundamentally a weapon of the previous war. The Kar 98 fired the 7.92 by 57mm Mauser cartridge from a 5-round internal magazine. To fire, the soldier had to manually operate the bolt after each shot. Pull up, draw back to eject the spent case, push forward to chamber a new round, rotate down to lock. Even a well-trained soldier needed nearly 2 seconds per shot when firing rapidly. The mechanical reality could not be overcome by training or courage alone. On Hill 609, as the battle intensified, Richter began to understand what his superiors had either not known or had chosen not to tell them. The Americans were not simply brave or numerous. They were armed with a weapon that fundamentally changed the equation of infantry combat. The semi-automatic rifle didn't just fire faster, it allowed American soldiers to suppress German positions, to maintain fire while maneuvering, to advance under a continuous covering barrage delivered by every rifleman in the squad. German squad tactics had evolved around the MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns. The squad existed to support the machine gun, to protect it, to feed it ammunition. The riflemen with their Kar 98s provided covering fire and protected the flanks, but the real firepower came from the machine gun. The Americans had reversed this doctrine. Every rifleman was a base of fire unto himself. Through the long morning, Richter fired until his shoulder ached from the recoil, until his thumb was raw from working the bolt and loading stripper clips. The Americans kept coming, not in wild charges but in coordinated movements, one group firing while another advanced. The Garands never seemed to stop. When one American reloaded, 2 others were still shooting. The volume of fire was suffocating. At one point, when the clouds lifted briefly, Richter saw an American patrol barely 20 meters away across a wadi. The encounter lasted seconds. The Americans, armed with their Garands, opened fire immediately. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. In that same span, the American patrol fired perhaps 15 rounds. The mathematical advantage was crushing. The distinctive metallic ping of an ejecting Garand clip became a sound that haunted the German defenders. Some had heard rumors that this sound betrayed when an American rifle was empty, that German soldiers could listen for it and attack. But in the chaos of battle, with mortars exploding and machine guns chattering and men screaming, the ping was just one more noise in the symphony of destruction. And even if you heard it, even if you knew one American was reloading, 4 others around him were still firing. The doctrine of overlapping fire meant the semi-automatic advantage was never truly interrupted. By midday, American forces had captured the lower slopes. The German defenders, despite their strong positions and determined resistance, were being systematically suppressed by firepower they could not match. Regiment Bauernthyn fought with the courage expected of troops imbued with Nazi doctrine, but courage alone could not answer the arithmetic of firepower. Werner, the young soldier from Bavaria, had bled out in the morning. Richter had watched 2 others fall during the afternoon, both shot while trying to reload. The pattern was consistent. German soldiers were most vulnerable in those seconds when they had to break their fighting position to feed fresh rounds into their magazines. American soldiers never had that same vulnerability. 8 rounds, fired as fast as the trigger could be pulled, then a 3-second reload and back to firing. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Richter understood something that would have seemed impossible just days before. The Germans were going to lose this hill, not because they lacked courage or training, not because their positions were weak or their tactics flawed, but because they were fighting the last war's battles with the last war's rifles, while the Americans had brought the next war's technology to the field. The Kar-98 was a magnificent weapon for its time, accurate, reliable, built with German precision, but against the M1 Garand, it was simply too slow. The difference between 15 rounds per minute and 50 rounds per minute wasn't marginal, it was decisive. It meant that for every German who could engage, 3 Americans could respond. It meant suppression. It meant momentum. It meant the Americans could advance while maintaining fire discipline. The battle for Hill 609 would continue into the next day, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The American 34th Infantry Division would take the summit on May 1st, opening the path toward Bizerte and the eventual collapse of Axis resistance in Tunisia. The battle has been called the American Army's Coming of Age, the first clear-cut American victory of the North African campaign. But it was also something else. It was a demonstration that the age of the bolt-action rifle as a primary infantry weapon had ended. Richter survived that day. As darkness fell and artillery fire slackened, he counted his remaining ammunition, 40 rounds left. In the morning, the attack would resume. He had his orders to hold, but as he lay in his fighting position, exhausted and haunted by the day's losses, one thought dominated all others. How do you fight an enemy when every one of their soldiers can fire 3 times as fast as you can? The question had no answer that night, but in the coming months, as American forces pushed through Sicily and into Italy, as they prepared for the invasion of France, Wehrmacht soldiers across Europe would confront the same terrible truth. The M1 Garand had changed the rules of engagement at the infantry level, and no amount of training or tactical excellence could overcome the fundamental advantage it provided. The rifle itself weighed 9.5 pounds empty, heavier than the 8.5-pound Kar-98. American soldiers complained about the weight during long marches, but in combat, that extra pound meant nothing. What mattered was the weight of fire, and in that calculation, the Garand was worth 3 bolt-action rifles. Production numbers told their own story of industrial might. Between 1936 and 1945, American factories produced approximately 5.4 million M1 Garand rifles. Springfield Armory led production with 3.5 million rifles, while Winchester Repeating Arms Company contributed over 500,000 more. Peak production at Springfield Armory reached 1,000 rifles per day by January 1944. This massive output ensured that virtually every American infantry, soldier and marine in the European and Pacific theaters carried the semi-automatic rifle by mid-1943. Germany, by contrast, had produced millions of Kar-98 rifles since the design's adoption, with production continuing throughout the war at various arsenals including Mauser, Irma, and others. But every single rifle was a bolt-action weapon. Germany had experimented with semi-automatic designs, most notably the Gewehr 41 and the improved Gewehr 43. But these never achieved widespread issue. Even late in the war, the vast majority of Wehrmacht infantrymen carried bolt-action rifles. The Sturmgewehr 44, the world's first assault rifle, arrived too late and in too few numbers to make a strategic difference. Only about 425,000 were produced, and most never reached frontline units until 1945. The German infantry, for the vast majority of the war, faced American GIs armed with semi-automatic rifles, while they themselves worked bolts between shots. On Hill 609, as Richter checked his rifle in the darkness, he had no knowledge of these production figures, no understanding of the industrial disparity between nations. He knew only what he had experienced that day. The Americans could shoot faster, reload faster, and maintain fire longer. The Garand's 8-round capacity meant fewer reloads than the Kar-98's 5 rounds. And the semi-automatic action meant those 8 rounds could be fired in the time it took to fire 3 bolt-action shots. Some German soldiers, when they captured American weapons, tried to use them. Ammunition was a problem, as the .30-06 Springfield round was different from the 7.92mm Mauser cartridge. But the bigger issue was the en-bloc clip system. The Garand used a unique loading method where a metal clip holding all 8 rounds was inserted into the rifle from above. Without these clips, the rifle was difficult to load with loose rounds. German soldiers could easily use captured Kar-98s or Springfields, which loaded with stripper clips or single rounds. But captured Garands were less practical without a supply of loaded en-bloc clips. More fundamentally, there was a psychological resistance. German military doctrine emphasized precision marksmanship and fire discipline. The idea of semi-automatic fire seemed wasteful, undisciplined. German officers worried that soldiers would shoot too quickly, waste ammunition, fail to aim properly. The bolt-action rifle enforced fire discipline through its mechanical limitations. You couldn't spray bullets wildly when you had to work the bolt between shots. But the Americans had discovered something the Germans had not fully embraced. In modern combat, volume of fire often mattered more than individual accuracy. A soldier who could fire 50 aimed shots per minute and hit 30% of them achieved 15 hits. A soldier who could fire 20 aimed shots per minute, even with 50% accuracy, achieved only 10 hits. The mathematics favored the higher rate of fire, assuming reasonable accuracy standards were maintained. The M1 Garand's semi-automatic action didn't mean American soldiers were less accurate. In fact, the opposite was often true. Because the shooter never had to break his sight picture or move his hands to work a bolt, he could maintain better focus on the target. The rifle's gas-operated action managed the recoil smoothly, and the shooter could pull the trigger again while still observing the previous shot's impact. This created a faster shot-to-shot recovery time and better practical accuracy in rapid-fire situations. German after-action reports from Tunisia began to mention the American semi-automatic rifles with increasing frequency. Intelligence officers noted that American infantrymen could maintain a higher rate of sustained fire than expected. Tactical recommendations emphasized the need for better use of machine guns to counter this advantage, but machine guns required multiple crew members, while every American rifleman brought semi-automatic firepower to the fight. As the night deepened on Hill 609, Richter finally allowed himself to sleep, his rifle beside him. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, more of that terrible sustained fire, more of watching his comrades fall during reload cycles, more of being outgunned by soldiers who were neither more skilled nor more courageous, but simply better equipped. The Battle of Hill 609 was not decided by rifle technology alone. American artillery, air support, and armored units all played crucial roles. But at the infantry level, where men fought for rocky outcrops and crude stone walls, the M1 Garand gave American soldiers an advantage that could not be overcome by German training or tactical skill. One American rifleman, in practical terms, could match 3 German riflemen in sustained fire. That was the simple, brutal mathematics that Richter and his comrades faced. In the darkness, exhausted and knowing what tomorrow would bring, Richter found himself wondering about the rifle that had dominated the day's fighting. Who had designed it? How long had the Americans been planning this advantage? Did the German High Command understand what was happening at the squad level, where Kar-98s faced Garands, and lost not through any fault of the weapon's quality, but through the fundamental limitation of bolt-action operation in an era of semi-automatic fire? These questions would have no answers for Richter. He would fight the next day and the day after, until either death or capture claimed him. But across Tunisia, and soon across Sicily and Italy, and eventually across France and Germany itself, Wehrmacht soldiers would learn the same lesson. The M1 Garand represented a technological leap that changed infantry combat forever. The rifle had its weaknesses, of course. American soldiers complained about Garand thumb, an injury that occurred when the bolt slammed forward on a soldier's thumb during loading if proper technique wasn't followed. The en-bloc clip system was unusual and took practice to master. The rifle was heavier than some bolt actions, making it tiring on long marches, and there was that distinctive ping when the empty clip ejected, though in the chaos of combat this proved to be a non-issue despite the persistent myth that enemy soldiers used it to time their attacks. But these were minor complaints compared to the overwhelming advantage the Garand provided. It gave the United States Army and Marine Corps a rifle that could fire as fast as a soldier could pull the trigger, that held 8 rounds instead of 5, that could be reloaded in 3 seconds, instead of the longer process of working individual rounds into a magazine. Most critically, it maintained the power and range of a full-sized rifle cartridge while delivering semi-automatic fire. On the morning of May 1, 1943, the final assault on Hill 609 began. Richter and the surviving defenders of Regiment Barenthin fought with desperation, knowing retreat was the only alternative to death or capture. The Americans came again, and again the Garands spoke with their terrible voice. By afternoon, American forces had secured the summit. Richter was among those captured. As American soldiers processed the prisoners, he noticed the rifles his captors carried. Up close, the maiden Garand looked solid, well made, but not particularly elegant. It lacked the refined lines of the Kar 98. But holding it, feeling its heft, he understood that elegance was not the point. This rifle had been designed for one purpose: to give every American infantryman overwhelming firepower. In that purpose, it had succeeded completely. In prisoner of war camps, German soldiers compared notes about the weapons they had faced. Tanks, aircraft, artillery, all received discussion, but many kept returning to the American rifle, that semi-automatic rifle that every American carried, the rifle that meant 1 GI could suppress 3 German soldiers, the rifle that had changed the basic calculus of infantry combat. Years later, after the war, former Wehrmacht soldiers interviewed about their experiences consistently mentioned American firepower as a decisive factor. The M1 Garand featured prominently in these recollections. Some admitted they had underestimated the Americans before facing them in combat. The semi-automatic rifle had been part of that awakening, a tangible demonstration that the United States had not simply mobilized numbers, but had armed those numbers with superior technology. The Battle of Hill 609 was one battle among thousands in the Second World War, but it crystallized a truth that would echo across every theater where American and German forces met. At the infantry level, the M1 Garand gave American soldiers an advantage that German bolt-action rifles could not overcome. 3-1. That was the ratio that mattered. One American rifleman with a Garand could match the firepower of 3 German riflemen with Kar 98s. This wasn't about courage or training or tactical skill. It was about mechanical advantage. It was about the difference between bolt-action and semi-automatic operation. It was about 8 rounds versus 5. About 40 to 50 rounds per minute versus 15 to 20. About 3-second reloads versus the longer process of feeding rounds individually or via stripper clips. As the campaign in Tunisia drew to its bloody conclusion in May 1943, with over 260,000 Axis prisoners taken, the lessons of Hill 609 spread through the Wehrmacht. American infantry were dangerous not just because of their numbers or their supporting arms, but because every single rifleman brought overwhelming firepower to the engagement. The age of the bolt-action rifle as the primary infantry weapon was ending. The M1 Garand was writing that ending in the hills of Tunisia, and soon it would continue writing it across Europe. For Klaus Richter and thousands like him, the war would continue in prisoner camps. But the memory of that terrible day on Hill 609 would remain. The memory of being outgunned by an enemy who could shoot 3 times as fast. The memory of watching comrades fall during reload cycles, while American soldiers maintained unceasing fire. The memory of learning, in the hardest possible way, that modern war had moved beyond the weapons his army still carried. The Kar 98 was a fine rifle, but against the M1 Garand, it was simply fighting the last war, and in modern combat, that was a fatal disadvantage. June 6, 1944, Normandy, France. Lieutenant Hans Vogel pressed himself into the sand behind a concrete bunker on Omaha Beach, watching the impossible unfold before him. Grey landing craft disgorged their human cargo into the surf, and despite the withering fire from German positions, the Americans kept coming. Vogel had studied the intelligence reports, had read about the semi-automatic rifles the Americans carried. But reading about firepower and experiencing it were entirely different things. The bunker's MG-42 machine gun hammered away, its 1,200 rounds per minute rate of fire cutting swaths through the attackers. But the Americans had something the intelligence reports hadn't fully conveyed. Every single rifleman, coming off those landing craft, carried a weapon that could answer back with devastating effect. The distinctive crack of M1 Garands rose above the chaos of battle, a sound that would become synonymous with American combat power. Vogel watched an American soldier take cover behind a steel beach obstacle. The soldier brought his Garand to his shoulder and fired 8 rounds in rapid succession at a German position 50 meters away. No pause to work a bolt, no interruption in his fire, just 8 rapid aimed shots that forced the German defenders to duck. By the time Vogel's men with their Kar-98s could return 3 or 4 shots, the American had reloaded and was firing again. The tactical reality of D-Day and the subsequent Normandy campaign revealed something American planners had counted on. The M1 Garand gave every infantryman the ability to fight effectively in the confused, close-quarters combat that characterized the hedgerow country. German squad tactics relied heavily on machine guns for suppressive fire. But in the bocage, where sight lines were measured in meters and engagements happened suddenly at close range, the American advantage became overwhelming. An American squad with M1 Garands could generate a volume of fire that matched or exceeded German squads built around machine guns. 8 men with Garands, firing at a sustained rate, could put out 320 to 400 rounds per minute. That was comparable to an MG-42, but distributed among 8 rifles instead of concentrated in one crew-served weapon. If the machine gun was knocked out, German firepower collapsed. If 1 or 2 American riflemen fell, the others continued maintaining pressure. Wehrmacht after-action reports from Normandy consistently noted the intensity of American small arms fire. Company and battalion commanders reported that American units could maintain suppressive fire during advances that German units, armed primarily with bolt-action rifles, could not match. The Americans advanced under their own covering fire, with riflemen taking turns moving while others maintained steady shooting. The semi-automatic advantage made this tactic practical in a way that bolt-action rifles simply did not allow. By late July 1944, as American forces broke out of Normandy during Operation Cobra, Wehrmacht units were in full retreat. The collapse was not solely due to rifle technology, of course. American artillery, air power, and armored forces all played decisive roles. But at the infantry level, where soldiers fought house to house and hedgerow to hedgerow, the M1 Garand gave American forces a persistent edge that accumulated across thousands of small engagements. Obergefreiter Friedrich Weber, a veteran who had fought in Russia before being transferred to France, later recalled his first encounter with American forces in the hedgerows near Saint-Lô. His squad had established a defensive position covering a crossroads, confident in their ability to hold against an American probe. The Kar-98s they carried had served them well on the Eastern Front against Soviet forces, many of whom still carried bolt-action Mosin Nagant rifles. But when the Americans attacked, Weber experienced something different. The volume of fire was staggering. Every American soldier seemed to be firing continuously. Weber got off 2 shots before having to duck as bullets chipped the stone wall protecting his position. He worked his bolt, aimed, fired. Worked his bolt, aimed, fired. 5 rounds gone. Time to reload. He fumbled with a stripper clip, pressed 5 fresh rounds into the magazine. By the time he raised his head again, the Americans had advanced across half the field. The Germans had an MG-42 in position, and its devastating rate of fire temporarily halted the American advance. But the American response was immediate and overwhelming. 8 Garands concentrated their fire on the machine gun position. The sustained barrage forced the crew to take cover, silencing the weapon. With the machine gun suppressed, American soldiers advanced while maintaining fire with their rifles. The Germans could not generate enough return fire with their bolt actions to stop the movement. Weber's squad withdrew after 10 minutes of fighting. They had inflicted casualties, but they could not hold the position. The mathematics of firepower had decided the engagement before it even began. One American squad with M1 Garands could generate more sustained rifle fire than a German squad with Kar-98s, even when the Germans had better defensive positions. The experience was repeated across France through the late summer and fall of 1944. Wehrmacht soldiers, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front or North Africa or Italy, found themselves consistently outgunned at the basic infantry level. The Kar-98 remained an excellent rifle. German marksmanship training remained superior to American standards, but precision shooting meant little when the enemy could fire 3 times as fast. Some Wehrmacht units obtained semi-automatic rifles of their own, the Gewehr 43. A gas-operated semi-automatic rifle feeding from a 10-round detachable magazine entered limited production in 1943, but only about 400,000 were produced during the entire war, compared to over 5 million M1 Garands. Most German infantrymen never saw a G43. They carried Kar-98s from France to the Rhine and beyond. The comparison between the G43 and the M1 Garand was telling. Both were semi-automatic, both fired full-power rifle cartridges, both gave their users a significant advantage over bolt-action rifles. But American industry had fielded the M1 8 years earlier and had produced it in quantities that ensured universal issue to infantry units. German industry, stretched thin by competing demands for tanks, aircraft, and other weapons systems, could never match this production. The German industry Wehrmacht fought most of the war armed with weapons designed for the previous conflict. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Wehrmacht forces launched their last major offensive in the west. In the Ardennes forests, German units temporarily gained the initiative through surprise and overwhelming force. But even in this desperate offensive, where German soldiers fought with fanatical determination, the firepower advantage of American rifles remained evident. A particular incident at a small crossroads near Bastogne illustrated the point. A German company, advancing during the early days of the offensive, encountered an American platoon that had been cut off from the main lines. The Germans had numerical superiority, better positions, and the tactical initiative. But the American platoon, armed entirely with M1 Garands, held the crossroads for over 2 hours. The Americans couldn't win the engagement. They were outnumbered and surrounded, but they could make the Germans pay a terrible price for every meter of ground. The M1 Garands maintained a constant volume of fire that disrupted German assault formations and forced them to take cover repeatedly. When the Americans finally exhausted their ammunition and surrendered, they had inflicted casualties far out of proportion to their numbers. German soldiers examining the American positions afterward counted hundreds of spent en-bloc clips. The Americans had gone through their ammunition at a prodigious rate, but that rate of fire had kept them in the fight far longer than should have been possible. Wehrmacht prisoners captured during the Allied counter-offensive in late December began appearing in interrogation reports. Intelligence officers noted a common theme. German soldiers expressed respect for American infantry weapons, particularly the M1 Garand. One captured Unteroffizier from the 5th Panzer Army stated simply, "Their rifles never stop shooting. You fire once, work the bolt, and 3 bullets answer back. Then you reload, and 8 more bullets come. It's like fighting 3 enemies for every one you see." This was the essential truth that Wehrmacht soldiers learned through bitter experience. The semi-automatic rifle had fundamentally changed infantry combat. It wasn't a marginal improvement. It was a revolutionary advantage that affected every firefight, every patrol, every defensive position. One American with a Garand equaled 3 Germans with Kar-98s in sustained fire capability. As 1945 began and Allied forces pushed into Germany itself, the disparity in infantry small arms became even more pronounced. Many Wehrmacht units were under strength, poorly supplied, and increasingly demoralized. But even units with good morale and adequate positions found themselves unable to hold against American infantry armed with M1 Garands. The rifle had become America's signature weapon, as recognizable as the Sherman tank or the P-51 Mustang. In the final months of the war, the Volkssturm, Germany's last-ditch militia of old men and young boys, was armed with whatever weapons could be found. Some carried captured weapons, including American M1 carbines taken during earlier battles. A member of the Volkssturm defending Berlin in early 1945 later recounted selecting an M1 carbine from a cart of mixed weapons, specifically because it was semi-automatic and came with loaded magazines. Even untrained civilians understood that semi-automatic fire was superior to bolt-action operation. The comparison extended beyond just the American and German rifles. British forces throughout the war relied primarily on the Lee-Enfield bolt-action rifle, though it had a 10-round magazine and a relatively fast bolt operation. Soviet forces used the Mosin-Nagant bolt-action rifle for most soldiers, with some specialized units receiving the SVT-40 semi-automatic rifle. Italian forces carried the Carcano bolt-action. Japanese forces, as covered in other accounts, carried the Arisaka bolt-action throughout the war. Only the United States equipped its entire infantry force with semi-automatic rifles as standard issue. This represented both an industrial achievement and a doctrinal commitment. The United States had recognized in the 1930s that the future of infantry combat lay in increased individual firepower. The M1 Garand was the manifestation of that recognition. By 1944, every American infantry division had thousands of Garands, ensuring that the tactical advantage reached every squad in every engagement. General George S. Patton's famous assessment that the M1 Garand was the greatest battle implement ever devised was not mere hyperbole. Patton understood warfare at the operational level, but he also understood that battles were decided by individual soldiers in individual firefights. The M1 Garand gave those soldiers a weapon that allowed them to win those firefights more consistently than their enemies could. The psychological impact of the M1 Garand cannot be overstated. German soldiers knew, before they ever entered combat with Americans, that they would face superior firepower at the rifle level. This knowledge affected morale, affected tactical planning, affected the willingness to engage in prolonged firefights. When Wehrmacht commanders planned defensive positions, they had to account for the fact that American infantry could generate extraordinary volumes of rifle fire. Wehrmacht tactical doctrine had evolved around certain assumptions: that machine guns provided the primary source of suppressive fire, that rifle fire was measured and disciplined, that infantry advances required careful fire and movement because individual soldiers needed time to work their bolts between shots. The M1 Garand invalidated all of these assumptions. American infantry could advance while maintaining continuous fire. American squads didn't need machine guns for suppression because their rifles provided it. American soldiers didn't need to carefully time their movements because they could shoot, advance, shoot again without the mechanical delay of bolt operation. Some German officers tried to adapt to this reality. Reports from late 1944 and early 1945 show recommendations to increase the density of machine guns in defensive positions, to emphasize concealment over exposure, even when shooting, to avoid prolonged firefights with American units. But these were tactical adjustments to a fundamental disadvantage. No amount of tactical innovation could fully compensate for the 3-to-1 firepower disparity at the individual soldier level. The M1 Garand also had an impact on German tactical thinking about semi-automatic and automatic weapons. The success of the Garand demonstrated that individual soldiers could handle semi-automatic fire effectively without wasting ammunition or losing fire discipline. This influenced post-war thinking that would eventually lead to the adoption of assault rifles and battle rifles by armies around the world. The Germans themselves had developed the Sturmgewehr 44, the world's first assault rifle, but it arrived too late and in too few numbers to affect the war's outcome. By V-Day, May 8, 1945, Wehrmacht soldiers who survived to see the war's end could reflect on what they had faced. The American M1 Garand had been one component of Allied superiority, but it was a component that touched every engagement at the infantry level. Former Wehrmacht soldiers interviewed years and decades after the war consistently mentioned the American rifle when discussing their combat experiences. One veteran, interviewed in the 1960s, stated, "The Kar-98 was a good rifle, very accurate, very reliable. But when you faced Americans with their Garands, you knew you were at a disadvantage. They could shoot so much faster. In the time it took you to fire 5 shots and reload, an American could fire 8, reload, and fire 8 more. You couldn't overcome that no matter how well you aimed." This assessment captured the essential reality. The M1 Garand wasn't perfect. It was heavy. The en bloc clip system was unusual. Garand thumb was a real hazard for careless loaders. But these were minor flaws compared to the overwhelming advantage the rifle provided in combat. Semi-automatic fire, 8-round capacity, 3-second reloads, and the ability to maintain fire without breaking sight picture combined to create a weapon that gave American infantry a decisive edge in small arms engagements. The production and supply chain that supported the M1 Garand was itself a weapon of war. American industry produced not just millions of rifles, but billions of rounds of .30-06 ammunition. American supply lines ensured that this ammunition reached frontline troops even in the depths of Europe. German soldiers often fought with limited ammunition supplies, making conservation essential. American soldiers could fire freely, knowing resupply was reliable. This abundance magnified the M1 Garand's advantage. A rifle that could fire 50 rounds per minute meant little if ammunition was scarce. But with abundant ammunition, the Garand became an instrument of overwhelming firepower. The legacy of the M1 Garand extended beyond World War II. The rifle served through the Korean War, where it again proved superior to the bolt-action rifles used by Chinese and North Korean forces. It was eventually replaced by the M1, which was essentially an improved M1 with a detachable box magazine and selective fire capability. The M1 itself reflected the enduring influence of John Garand's design. In a remarkable historical irony, the United States supplied M1 Garand rifles to the newly formed Japanese self-defense forces in the 1950s. Japanese soldiers who had faced the weapon during World War II now trained with prime dependable, experiencing firsthand the firepower advantage their fathers and brothers had confronted in the Pacific. Japanese veterans consistently cited the M1 Garand as one of the decisive weapons of the war. One Japanese veteran stated in an interview, "We could match American courage, we could match American tactics, but we could never match American firepower. Every GI with his automatic rifle was worth 3 of our soldiers." For Wehrmacht soldiers, the lesson was similar. The Kar-98 was a fine rifle, perhaps the finest bolt-action battle rifle ever made, but against the M1 Garand, it was outclassed. The gap was not in quality or accuracy or reliability. The gap was in rate of fire, in sustained firepower, in the ability to maintain offensive pressure without pause, and that gap proved decisive in thousands of engagements from Tunisia to the Rhine. The story of the Wehrmacht encountering the M1 Garand is not primarily a story of German failure. German soldiers fought with courage and skill throughout the war. The Kar-98 was an excellent weapon by the standards of its design philosophy, but the M1 Garand represented a fundamental leap forward in infantry small arms technology. It was the first standard-issue semi-automatic rifle in military history, and it changed warfare at the most basic level, the individual soldier's ability to deliver lethal fire on an enemy target. Standing on Hill 609 in Tunisia, or in a hedgerow in Normandy, or in the Ardennes forests, or in a ruined German city in 1945, Wehrmacht soldiers confronted the same reality. They were armed with rifles designed for the last war, facing enemies armed with rifles designed for modern combat. One American rifleman matched 3 German riflemen in sustained fire. That 3-to-1 advantage, multiplied across entire armies and entire campaigns, was part of the reason the Allies won the war. Technology alone does not determine military outcomes. Leadership, logistics, strategy, industrial capacity, morale, training, and countless other factors all contribute. But at the sharp end of combat, where individual soldiers faced each other with rifles, The M1 Garand gave American forces an advantage that German soldiers could feel and measure and could not overcome. The semi-automatic rifle had arrived, and the age of the bolt action as the primary infantry weapon had ended. The Wehrmacht learned this lesson in the blood and fire of World War II, taught by a rifle that could shoot 3 times as fast as their own. The M1 Garand was not just a weapon, it was a manifestation of American industrial power, American tactical thinking, and American commitment to equipping individual soldiers with the best possible tools for survival and victory. John Garand's design, refined over 17 years and produced by the millions, gave the United States Army and Marine Corps a weapon that historians would rightly call decisive. General Patton's praise was earned in countless battles where American soldiers, armed with Garands, faced enemies armed with bolt-action rifles and won through superior firepower. For Wehrmacht soldiers who survived the war, the memory of the M1 Garand's distinctive sound remained vivid decades later. The rapid crack-crack-crack of semi-automatic fire, the relentless pressure of 8 rounds fired in seconds, the terrible realization that you were being shot at 3 times as fast as you could shoot back. These memories defined combat against American forces in a way that no amount of training or courage could overcome. The mathematical reality was inescapable. 40 to 50 rounds per minute versus 15 to 20, 8 rounds versus 5, 3-second reloads versus longer manual feeding, semi-automatic operation versus bolt action. The M1 Garand wasn't marginally better than the Kar-98. It was fundamentally superior in the role it was designed to fill, providing individual infantrymen with rapid, sustained firepower. As the sun set on the Third Reich in May 1945, Wehrmacht soldiers laid down their Kar-98 rifles for the last time. These rifles had served faithfully, had been accurate and reliable, had been well-made instruments of war, but they had been instruments of the last war, carried into a conflict where semi-automatic rifles had redefined what infantry firepower meant. The Wehrmacht had fought bravely with them, but bravery alone could not bridge the gap in rate of fire. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.